When World War II ended in August 1945, the men who had led Japan's military faced a reckoning. Some were arrested, others fled, a few took their own lives. Trials began. Occupation forces investigated war crimes. Newspapers printed the names of generals who had commanded armies across Asia and the Pacific. But behind these men were women whose stories rarely appear in history books. The wives of Japan's generals lived in a unique world shaped by rank, status, privilege, and the rigid expectations of wartime society. When the empire collapsed, their lives collapsed with it. Their husbands faced prosecution. Their families lost wealth and protection. Their social status evaporated almost overnight. What happened to these women is a lesser-known chapter of Japan's post-war transformation. Some disappeared into quiet civilian life. Others struggled to escape stigma. A few became symbols of loyalty. Some were forced to rebuild from nothing. Their stories reveal how war reshapes not only nations but families' identities and private lives. To understand what became of them, we must begin with the moment everything changed. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on the 15th of August 1945, civilians listened in stunned silence. Families of military leaders felt the shock more deeply than most. They knew that defeat meant scrutiny. It meant the possibility of arrest. It meant that the protections granted by the Imperial Army and Navy were gone. Generals' wives had spent years living within military compounds or official residences. Their daily life involved hosting gatherings, supporting officers' families, raising children under militaristic values, and maintaining the image of disciplined households. Some lived in relative comfort, even during the hardest years of the war. Others carried emotional burdens, as their husbands disappeared to distant fronts. Surrender shattered the structure of their lives. Their husbands became targets of occupation authorities. Their homes were investigated or confiscated. Their children faced stigma as the nation reassessed its past. Their social networks vanished as the military dissolved. Many had no income. Some had no property. Others suddenly found themselves responsible for families while their husbands were imprisoned or in hiding. The end of the war was not a moment of peace for them. It was the beginning of a new struggle. As Allied occupation forces spread across Japan, they arrested military leaders accused of planning aggressive war or overseeing atrocities. Generals who had once commanded massive armies were now prisoners. Their wives watched them taken away, often without knowing if they would ever return. Some generals committed suicide before arrest. Their wives became widows instantly. These women faced the emotional shock of sudden loss, combined with the collapse of financial support. In traditional Japanese society, widowhood carried its own expectations of dignity, silence, and withdrawal. Many followed these expectations and lived quietly, avoiding all public attention. Other generals were tried in Tokyo or in tribunals across Asia. Their wives attended hearings when allowed. They read newspaper reports anxiously. Some hoped their husbands would be acquitted. Others feared the worst. When death sentences were handed down, families were completely devastated. These women became political symbols whether they wanted to or not. Some people blamed them by association. Others treated them with pity. A few were admired for standing by their husbands. But most were simply overwhelmed by the uncertainty. When their husbands were executed or sentenced to long imprisonment, the women were left to rebuild their lives alone. Before the war, Japan's generals were part of an elite class. They received salaries, land grants, and prestige. Their families had access to schools, healthcare, domestic staff, and secure housing. Wives of generals hosted official functions and lived in neighborhoods reserved for military officers. After the war, these privileges disappeared. Occupation authorities dissolved the military and stripped war criminals of rank, pension, and property. Homes were confiscated or repurposed. Land reforms eliminated the old aristocratic system that had supported many elite families. Generals' wives suddenly faced loss of income, fanti loss of housing fadin, pressure to leave military neighborhoods, fadi fidsi legal uncertainty feti public suspicion. Some had young children to support. Others had elderly parents living with them. With no profession, many had to learn skills and seek work for the first time. It was a stark reversal of fortune. Women who had managed large households found themselves living in small rented rooms, struggling to buy food in the aftermath of wartime shortages. Yet they had no choice but to adapt. In post-war Japan, many people felt betrayed by the military leadership. Civilians had suffered bombings, hunger. When details of the war began emerging, resentment toward generals grew. Wives of generals carried this stigma. Their association with military leadership made them targets of judgment. Some were whispered about in their neighborhoods. Others were pressured to avoid public gatherings. Some hid family connections entirely. The stigma affected children as well. Children of high-ranking officers were sometimes bullied or excluded, especially in the early occupation years. Mothers often encouraged their children to keep quiet about their family background. This silence created a kind of generational wound. Many families avoided discussing the war for decades, partly to protect themselves from shame, and partly to move forward in a society desperate to rebuild. After the initial chaos, many generals' wives settled into quiet civilian life. They took on new identities far removed from their former status. Some became teachers or nurses. Others worked in small businesses. A few took jobs far below their previous social level, simply to survive. Many raised their children with an emphasis on humility and hard work. These women often avoided political discussions. They rarely talked openly about their husbands' roles in the war. Instead, they focused on rebuilding stability. A few remarried, though this was less common due to cultural expectations. Most remained widows or lived separately from imprisoned husbands. Their daily lives were defined by survival rather than social ambition. This quiet reinvention became a defining theme. These women blended into the post-war landscape, invisible and unacknowledged, yet carrying stories that shaped their families for generations. Not every general's wife chose a quiet life. A small number became public figures in their own right, advocating for their husband's innocence or reduced sentences. These women wrote letters to occupation authorities, spoke to newspapers, or organized groups of family members. Their arguments varied. Some insisted their husbands were following orders. Following orders, said the charges were exaggerated. Some sought mercy rather than acquittal. Their activism drew both sympathy and criticism. Supporters admired their loyalty. Critics saw them as refusing to accept responsibility. A few succeeded in securing early release for their husbands. Others saw their efforts fail, but continued advocating until their own deaths. Their persistence added a human dimension to the war crimes, debates, and highlighted the emotional turmoil families faced. Not every general was executed or sentenced to life imprisonment. Some served several years before being released, especially as Cold War politics shifted and the United States sought Japan as an ally. When these men returned home, their wives faced a new challenge. Reintegration was difficult. Husbands came back changed by imprisonment. They struggled with shame and discomfort in a country transformed by democratic reforms and rapid economic growth. Wives had to rebuild marriages strained by years of separation. Some couples rebuilt strong families. Others drifted apart emotionally. Some lived as quiet companions rather than equal partners. The experience of reunion varied widely, but in all cases, wives acted as anchors, helping their families adjust to a rapidly changing Japan. As Japan entered the 1950s and 1960s, the economy grew quickly. New industries appeared. Society modernized. Younger generations moved on from wartime memories. For the wives of Japan's generals, this era brought a mixture of relief and continued complexity. They now lived in a country where their husband's authority no longer existed. Fitting new values emphasized peace, not militarism. Social mobility depended on work. Not ranked city, the military was restricted by Article 9(7). Public attention shifted to economic recovery in this environment. Many generals' wives became almost invisible. They were elderly, widowed, or living quietly in modest homes. Their pasts were rarely discussed outside their families. Yet the influence of their experiences shaped their children and grandchildren. Some families distanced themselves from military history entirely. Others preserved private memories of service and loss. The transition from elite military households to ordinary post-war families was one of the most dramatic social changes in modern Japanese history. A smaller number of generals' wives left Japan entirely. Some followed their children abroad. Others sought a new start far from the stigma of wartime associations. A few moved to the United States, especially if their children married Americans during the occupation. Others moved to Brazil, a popular destination for Japanese emigrants. Some joined religious communities abroad seeking spiritual healing after the trauma of war and loss. Their lives became quiet chapters in the Japanese diaspora. The children of generals' wives grew up in a complex environment. They loved their parents but often sensed unspoken burdens. Many did not know the full details of their father's wartime roles until adulthood. In some families, the truth emerged only after both parents had died. Wives of generals were often the guardians of these memories. They decided what to share and what to hide. Their silence protected their families, but it also created tension. Later generations sometimes struggled to understand why their family history felt incomplete. This silence reflects a larger pattern in post-war Japan, where many families avoided discussing the war's darker chapters. The wives of generals carried the weight of this silence more heavily than most. As they grew older, some generals' wives took on the responsibility of preserving historical documents, letters, medals, and diaries. They felt a duty to ensure that future generations would understand their husbands' lives in full, not just through war crimes trials. These women donated materials to museums, historical societies, or universities. Others kept them within their families but encouraged their children to learn from them. A few wrote memoirs that provided rare insight into military families before and after the war. Their accounts revealed the personal costs of service, loyalty, displacement, and rebuilding. Their voices helped historians understand what military families endured during Japan's transition from empire to peaceful democracy. By the 1990s and early 2000s, most wives of wartime generals had passed away. The few who remained were elderly, living in care homes or with their children. Some agreed to interviews. Their stories were often gentle, reflective, and deeply human. Loneliness during their husbands' campaigns, fear during air raid City, shock during surrender Tsuchishima, during occupation Tsubi, the challenge of rebuilding Tsubi, love for their children Tsudin. Complicated feelings about the past, their reflections, provide a rare look into a group of women who lived through extraordinary change. The story of Japan's generals is well documented. Their wartime actions, their trials, and their fates are the subjects of books and documentaries. But the story of their wives is quieter, more personal, and often overlooked. These women lived through dramatic transformations: the collapse of an empire, the loss of status and privilege, the arrest or death of their husbands, the struggle to rebuild families, the stigma of association, the challenge of raising children in a changing society. They navigated grief, hardship, reinvention, and silence. Their stories reveal how war affects not only leaders, but the people around them. They show how families can lose everything and still find ways to move forward. And they remind us that the human cost of war is carried not only by those who fight, but also by the ones waiting at home. Their resilience shaped post-war Japan in ways history books rarely acknowledge. Their quiet strength carried their families into a new era.